Watch what you're doing! James screamed at Ruth. Her heart pounds as she stumbles back, her body crashed into the wall of the grand hallway. Glass shattered across the floor, and the sound of the vase smashing echoed in the silent mansion. She froze as she turned to face him. James, the billionaire owner of the lavish mansion, where she worked, stood only a few feet away. His usually composed demeanor was now replaced with anger. He looked different. "I didn't mean to, I'm sorry," Ruth stammered, quickly scrambling to gather the pieces of the broken vase. But James didn't move. He just stared at her, his chest boiling with frustration. "You've been here for weeks, and this is the second time I've caught you messing things up," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "I'll clean it up. I promise," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But James didn't answer. He stood there for a moment, his eyes cold and hard. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Ruth standing in her mess. Ruth had always dreamed of a better life. Growing up in a small and cramped apartment in a ghetto neighborhood, she learned early on that dreams weren't always easy to chase. Her chance came when she saw an advert for a maid position in a grand mansion on the outskirts of town. The job promised good pay, steady work, and the opportunity to escape her current life. The mansion was a world away from her humble beginnings, a place that looked nothing like the rundown buildings she was used to. Everything about it, the sprawling gardens, the marble floors, the sparkling chandeliers, was a symbol of a life she never thought she'd have. Ruth didn't think twice before applying. When she got the job, she felt like she had won the lottery. She packed her few belongings, left behind the cluttered apartment, and moved into a small room provided by her new employer. At first, everything was exciting. Ruth would wake up early each morning, put on her maid uniform, and begin her work. Dusting, cleaning, sweeping, and mopping, every room needed attention, and every corner required care. The mansion was always spotless, and Ruth took pride in the work she did. There was something about the grandness of the place that made her feel small yet significant, as though her role, no matter how menial, was still important. The mansion was owned by James, a man she had heard of but never met. He was a well-known billionaire, a business tycoon who was successful in ways Ruth couldn't even comprehend. All she knew was that his wealth was immense, his presence commanding, and his reputation ruthless. People spoke about him in whispers, with a kind of fear mixed with awe. To Ruth, he seemed like someone who existed in a different world, a world where people like her didn't stand a chance. When Ruth first saw him, she was cleaning the grand staircase in the entry hall. He walked past her without a glance, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space. He didn't notice her, and she didn't expect him to. He was the owner of everything, and she was just the maid. It didn't bother Ruth at first. She didn't come to the mansion to make friends. She came for a fresh start, and as long as she could keep her head down and do her job, that was all that mattered. The more she worked, the more she realized how little she knew about the life James led. His mansion was a symbol of the life she had always dreamed of, one filled with wealth, luxury, and status, but it was also a place of silence, distance, and coldness. Ruth didn't know if James was always like this, but it felt like he lived in a world that no one else could touch. Over time, Ruth began to notice small things about him. His routine was strict and predictable. He would spend long hours in his office or study, only leaving for meetings or events. He rarely socialized with the staff, keeping to himself and never engaging in casual conversation. He was a man of few words. One morning, Ruth was cleaning the kitchen when she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find James standing in the doorway, his eyes briefly scanning the room before resting on her. She froze, unsure what to do. It was rare for him to speak to anyone, let alone her. "Are you busy?" he asked, his voice smooth but distant. Ruth didn't know how to answer. She was used to working silently in the background, rarely interacting with anyone. But now, with James standing there, she felt a strange wave of nervousness. She quickly nodded, trying to focus on her work. "I was just finishing," she said softly, not meeting his gaze. James stepped further into the kitchen, his gaze still fixed on her. Ruth felt her heart race. He was so close, and yet so far. A powerful man in a suit, standing there in the kitchen like it was the most normal thing in the world. "I've noticed you've been doing a good job," he said, his voice quiet but direct. Ruth blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. James," she replied, unsure how to respond. She had never expected him to notice her work, let alone compliment her. James nodded once, as if satisfied with her answer, and turned to leave. "Keep it up," he said, his tone not unfriendly, but still distant. As he walked away, Ruth stood frozen in the kitchen. She hadn't expected such a simple exchange to throw her off balance, but it did. Over the next few days, Ruth found herself thinking about James more often. But then came another encounter, one that changed everything. Ruth was in the main hallway, dusting the grand chandelier above the staircase, when she heard the sound of footsteps. She didn't need to look to know it was James. His presence was unmistakable, and the air around him seemed to change whenever he entered a room. She braced herself, ready to continue her work, but to her surprise, he stopped in front of her. "Ruth," he said, his voice softer than usual. "How are you settling in?" Ruth blinked, taken aback. This was the first time James had asked her a question like this. He had never shown much interest in her personal life before. She paused for a moment before responding. "I'm managing well," she said, keeping her voice polite and neutral. James nodded, studying her for a moment. "You don't talk much, do you?" Ruth didn't know how to answer. She wasn't shy, but there was something about James that made her feel like an outsider. She didn't want to share too much with him, but his question hung in the air. I just don't have much to say," she replied finally. James didn't press her any further. Instead, he just looked at her for a long moment, as if thinking something over. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Ruth stood there, unsure of what had just happened. She had been caught off guard by his sudden interest in her. She had always assumed that he didn't care about the staff, but now, she wasn't so sure. It was a small exchange, but it left Ruth with more questions than answers. What did he really think of her? Was there something more to his actions than she understood? For the first time since she arrived, Ruth felt like there was a crack in the wall between them. It was tiny, but it was enough to make her wonder, could it be possible that James, the billionaire owner of this grand mansion, was noticing her? And if so, what did it mean for her future here? As she resumed cleaning, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that things were beginning to change. She had only just started her new life in the mansion, but it seemed that her journey was about to become much more complicated than she had ever expected. The days at the mansion settled into a routine, one that Ruth had quickly gotten used to. She would wake up early every morning, ready to tackle the tasks at hand. The big mansion always needed cleaning, dusting, mopping, polishing. No matter how much effort she put in, the work seemed endless. Ruth didn't mind it, though. It was far better than the cramped apartment she had left behind. And the pay was good, too. She could send money back home to her family, and that gave her a sense of satisfaction. Most of the time, she worked in silence, moving from one room to the next. The other staff members were polite but distant, focused on their tasks and never really engaging in casual conversation. She didn't mind. Ruth had never been one for small talk anyway. She kept her head down, did her job, and avoided unnecessary attention. But then there were days when something felt different. The stillness of the mansion seemed to carry a heavy tension, and Ruth couldn't quite put her finger on why. Sometimes, it was the way James would appear in the hallway, walking by without a word, his presence so commanding that it felt like the air itself shifted around him. Other times, it was the way his eyes would linger just a moment too long as he passed her, making her heart race for reasons she couldn't understand. It wasn't that James did anything to make her feel this way. He didn't speak to her often, and when he did, it was brief and to the point. He had a coldness about him that made it clear he didn't want to engage with the staff, much less someone like Ruth. It wasn't until one afternoon that Ruth began to see that there was indeed more to James than she had first assumed. It started when Ruth was cleaning the kitchen, something she did every day, sometimes twice. The marble countertops and gleaming silver appliances always seemed to catch fingerprints or crumbs, no matter how much effort she put in. It was almost as if the kitchen was too perfect, demanding constant care and attention. As Ruth wiped down the counters, she heard footsteps approaching. At first, she didn't think much of it. There were always people moving about the mansion, coming and going, and she was used to the sounds of the staff moving through the halls. But when she turned to see who it was, her heart skipped a beat. James stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his arms crossed, watching her. His expression was neutral, but there was something in the way he looked at her that made Ruth feel suddenly aware of every movement she made. "Are you busy?" James asked, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. Ruth froze for a moment, unsure how to respond. She was used to speaking to the staff, but James? "I was just getting some coffee," he said, stepping into the room and walking toward the counter where the coffee machine was. Ruth continued to wipe the counters, trying to keep her focus on her work. He opened the cupboard and took out a mug, then moved toward the coffee machine. Ruth couldn't help but watch him for a moment. When James turned to face her again, his eyes met hers, and for the shortest moment, their gazes locked. Ruth quickly looked down, feeling a flush creep up her neck. She wasn't used to being looked at like that. He didn't seem uncomfortable, but she did. "Thank you for keeping everything so clean," James said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm. "I'm sure it's not easy." Ruth looked up in surprise. James had never thanked her for anything before. In fact, he had barely acknowledged her existence. But now, here he was, speaking to her as if she mattered. She didn't know how to respond. It's my job," Ruth said quietly, avoiding his gaze. She didn't want to make it sound like she was fishing for compliments. But hearing him thank her was something she hadn't expected. James smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile that softened his features. It was the first time Ruth had seen him smile, and it made her heart flutter unexpectedly. There was something about the way his face changed, like a mask that slipped just for a moment, that made him seem more human, more approachable. "Still, you do a good job," he said. "I appreciate it." Ruth nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't want to make the moment awkward by saying too much, so she simply murmured, "Thank you." For a moment, they both stood in silence, the only sound being the faint bubbling of the coffee machine. Ruth continued to wipe down the counters, feeling oddly self-conscious with him standing so close. But then, as if sensing her discomfort, James spoke again. "Do you like working here?" he asked, his voice casual, but Ruth could hear the underlying curiosity. It wasn't a question she had expected. Most of the time, people didn't ask her personal questions. They didn't care. She was just a worker, a cog in the machine. But James's question made her pause. Did she like working here? She had never really thought about it. On the one hand, the mansion was beautiful, and the pay was good. But on the other hand, it was isolating. She spent most of her days cleaning and never really interacted with anyone other than the staff. It's okay," Ruth answered carefully. "I mean, it's a job, and I'm grateful for it. But it's different from what I'm used to." James seemed to understand. He didn't press her for more details, but the way he looked at her made her feel like he was actually listening, like he cared about her answer. "I know it must be hard," he said. "It's a big place, and the work never ends." Ruth nodded. "It does feel like that sometimes." They stood in silence again, and for a moment, it felt like the world had paused around them. Ruth couldn't quite understand why James was talking to her like this. She had never seen this side of him before, the side that seemed thoughtful, even compassionate. "Well," James said, finally breaking the silence, "I'll let you get back to your work." "But thank you, again, Ruth." Ruth turned to look at him as he started to walk away, and for the first time, she felt a little more than just a maid. "Thank you, Mr. James," she replied, her voice a little more confident now. James nodded and left the room, leaving Ruth standing there, wondering if she had imagined the whole exchange. But as she continued her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The days after their brief conversation were strange for Ruth. It wasn't that anything had changed drastically, but something felt different, like a shift in the air around her. She could still feel the soft weight of James's words lingering in her mind, like they had been some kind of quiet promise. After that encounter in the kitchen, Ruth found herself more aware of James's presence. Every time he walked through the halls, her attention would snap to him involuntarily. It was the little things that changed. When she would see him walking past her in the hallways, she felt her pulse quicken. He still didn't speak to her much, but he would give her a brief nod, or sometimes even a glance. Those small moments made Ruth feel like something had shifted between them, even though neither of them had really said anything important. The work at the mansion continued as usual. Ruth kept herself busy with the never-ending chores, but something was on her mind. She wondered why James had started acknowledging her. It wasn't just a simple thank you here or there. It was the way he looked at her, more like a real person, not just a maid doing her job. She had never imagined that someone like him would ever take an interest in her, and yet, it seemed that something was slowly changing. One morning, Ruth was dusting the grand piano in the music room when she heard footsteps approaching. She didn't even have to look up to know who it was. She had gotten so used to his presence that she could recognize it without thinking. James was coming down the hall, and she could feel the air shift around her. This time, though, as she continued to wipe down the piano keys, James didn't just pass by. Instead, he stopped in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his eyes scanning the room. Ruth could feel him watching her, but she didn't dare look up. She focused on the task at hand, trying to ignore the racing thoughts in her head. "You've been working hard," James's voice broke through the silence. Ruth paused for a moment, then looked up at him. He was standing there, watching her, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time he had noticed her work, but there was something different about the way he said it now. It was as if he had been paying more attention, and she wasn't sure how to respond to that. "Thank you, Mr. James," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't speak for a moment, his eyes fixed on her. "You don't have to call me that," he said quietly. "James is fine." The words hung in the air, and Ruth felt her heart skip a beat.